Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and today my guest is Professor Christopher Ragan, who is the Associate Professor and Founding Director of McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy, as well as the author of a recent op-ed titled Western Alienation is Real and Cannot Be Dismissed. So welcome to the Energy Show, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hear this in the West all the time. I mean, I'm a Western boy. I've spent my entire life in Western Canada. I'm old enough to remember the Western Canada Concept Party doing the rounds in the early 1980s, that in Saskatoon when I was going to university. And so I'm familiar with all of the arguments here. But why don't you summarize it for the viewers?
Okay, so as I said in the column, I'm a Westerner as well. I was born and raised in Edmonton, and then I left when I was 18 to go further west to go to university in Victoria. And then, I went through some other universities, spent some time in the United States, and then came to Montreal. So I've been in Montreal, which makes me, to Westerners, that makes me an Easterner, for the last 35 years. And it's puzzled me that as a displaced Albertan, I kind of recognize Western alienation. I recognize it when it heats up. I recognize it when it cools down. But I think I'm surrounded by people in Ontario and Quebec that really don't get it. So when I read Preston Manning's column in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago, and I've known Preston for a while, to me, the article was, number one, not that surprising. And number two, I knew that there was, Western alienation was heating up again. And so it wasn't very surprising to me. Now, I think he went a little bit over the top, but he is a provocative guy and very thoughtful guy. And what I wanted to do was to say, look, don't dismiss this so quickly. You may not fully accept, the details of Preston Manning's argument. You may not accept that, as he claims, a vote for the Carney-led Liberals is a vote for Western secession. I don't think I believe that. And I am certainly not a fan of Western secession or Alberta secession or Saskatchewan secession. I don't want to see any secession. But I absolutely recognize that Alberta and Saskatchewan, but most of this ends up being about Alberta, that Alberta has some legitimate complaints. And so I wanted to just, write those down, not all of them, but just give a sense that there is a legitimate beef here. And so I basically started the story with going back to the National Energy Program of 1980, which is still remembered by many people in Alberta. Even if you're 85 in Alberta, you still remember it. I mean, maybe if you're 35 in Alberta, you don't remember it, but almost certainly you've heard of it. But this was a time when Alberta viewed Ottawa and an Ottawa Liberal Party led by Pierre Trudeau as, taking basically a resource grab, right? Transferring money, intervening in the oil market to transfer money effectively from the west to the east. Think about it that way. Sorry, you want to interrupt?
No, I don't want to interrupt. This is the wrap up that thought, and I'll ask you another question.
Fine.
Okay.
So I think it kind of starts then, and maybe in fact it even starts earlier than 1980. But that's kind of when I, became a sentient being, and it certainly dates back to 1980, if not earlier. And I guess I'll just say very quickly that I think it continues to simmer along. Sometimes it heats up, sometimes it cools down, but certainly the last 10 years has been perceived by many Albertans, as a time when another Ottawa Liberal government led by another Trudeau hasn't been particularly caring about Alberta or, sensitive to those issues. So let me just stop there, and then we can go into more detail if you want.
Sounds good. Well, look, last week, an Angus Reid poll came across my inbox that is pertinent to what we're talking about today. So it asked the question across at all the respondents in all the provinces, how do you feel about your province leaving Confederation? And in Alberta, only 25% of people said, and this was the highest in Canada. Oh, sorry, a little lower than Quebec. So 25% and 20% in Saskatchewan. When they asked the question about how do you feel about it if there's another Liberal government, then in Alberta, the percentage went up to 30, and in Saskatchewan, 33. So I would take away from that that a lot of the dissatisfaction is in fact not about separatism or secession. It's about dissatisfaction with the Liberals.
I
And
think that, yeah.
and I
Well,
would
I think that's exactly right.
I would,
So,
okay, I just want to make one more point. I would further argue that we didn't see a lot of it under the progressive conservative government from, well, it was in power for 44 years. But the ones that I remember are like Ed Stelmach in 2007, and then Alison Redford, and then the NDP government under Rachel Notley, which does span some of the overlap with some of the Trudeau governments. And still, I didn't see a lot of secession. It's really been since Jason Kenney became United Conservative Party Premier in 2019, and Danielle Smith took over in 2022.
so I agree with that. And I agree, it's just those polling numbers that you talked about, or survey numbers, I think are very important. Because I actually think the problem with, I guess, Preston Manning's column is he talked about Western secession as the issue. And then I think a lot of people can dismiss it as being extreme, or you can dismiss it as saying, well, there's only 25% support for secession. I'm not a believer in secession. Okay. I think secession is the wrong place to focus. If you were to ask a different question, if you were to ask Albertans, are there a bunch of issues that you're not happy about with, relationship between Alberta and the federal government? Boy, I bet you those numbers would be a lot higher. And when you start talking about the broader concept of Western alienation, okay, so just sources of dissatisfaction in Alberta and Saskatchewan, I think actually there's sort of two types. I think there are points of dissatisfaction that really aren't very sensible, okay? And I think there are sources of dissatisfaction that are extremely sensible. So to me, the great example of the not very sensible is the basic notion that Alberta doesn't get its fair fiscal share in Canada. Okay. I mean, frankly, I think that's silly. Alberta is the richest province in the country by far. Okay. I live in, one of the poorest provinces in the country. We have an equalization program. The federal government has an equalization program that is designed to maintain, roughly comparable access to public goods at roughly comparable tax rates. And what that means is Alberta doesn't receive equalization payments, but Quebec does. Now, there's no equalization fund that provinces pay into. You just pay your good old federal taxes, whether it's GST or federal income taxes or corporate income taxes. You pay it into the federal pot, and the federal government does with it what it does with it. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of grievances that really aren't very sensible grievances. Sure. But I also think, category two, there are some grievances that are absolutely legitimate. And that's why I tried to lay out in that column. I think the National Energy Program was a legitimate grievance. I think the proposed emissions cap is a bad policy, both in economic and political terms. I think there is generally a sense in Alberta that the family business in Alberta, which is oil and gas, right? The family business is disrespected, denigrated, and held by many people in the East to be immoral, right? And I got just not the beginning of a good relationship, right, or the basis of a good relationship. So I think there are some legitimate beefs.
Let me take issue with that, and I'll point viewers back to the April 7th Energy show where I talked about Pierre Poilievre, and I was trying to explain where Pierre Poilievre comes from, because I know hundreds of Pierre Poilievres in Calgary.
Yeah.
And chip on the shoulder, that kind of thing. And here's the basic argument. We don't talk about this a lot, but if you look at the global oil scene, what you see is that the US is at the top, produces 13.2 million barrels a day. In second and third place are Russia and Saudi Arabia, around 9.2, 9.3 million. Who's fourth? Canada at 5 million barrels a day. Of those four countries, or producers, Only Alberta is landlocked. Only Alberta has to get its infrastructure through other governments, other jurisdictions that are sometimes not friendly to its ambitions. And I think that a lot of the anger you're seeing now comes out of the Alberta, the oil and gas industry, out of the government, out of the business community, because they see that they have 170 billion barrels of bitumen in reserve, and they have the oil sands producers have innovative to lower their break even so that they can compete with just about
Yeah.
anybody on the global market. They want to be Saudi Arabia and Russia. That's where they want to be. And given the circumstances, probably could be. And they've been frustrated in their ambitions because British Columbia, the federal government, maybe Quebec, all of these other governments have conspired to frustrate them and not build the infrastructure that's required for them to reach their full potential. That's my argument. And I think that there's
100%.
right.
I mean, are you looking for me to disagree? Because I agree with everything you just said. So let's back up and we kind of start with this recognition. And you said it, right? That Alberta or Canada, but most of that is Alberta, is the fourth largest producer. We have enormous reserves of oil, natural gas. You know, some of that oil is conventional. Most of it now is oil sands. But natural gas, we also have, I mean, huge reserves of coal. But anyway, we have enormous reserves of these natural resources, and the world wants those resources. The world is hungry or thirsty for those resources and is prepared to pay good money. Now, my view about sort of economic development in this country is that we would be crazy not to produce those resources as long as we can do it economically, which means there's a world out there that wants to pay a high enough price to do it, and we can extract it at a low enough cost. And I would add, as long as we can do it in a way that is, let me call it locally environment friendly, right? I mean, I think we should be worrying about our tailings ponds, and we should be worrying about whether we're wiping out forests and whether we're dumping toxic sludge in rivers. Like, we should be not doing those things. But as long as we can extract these resources and sell them to a world that wants them, I guess my view is, as the federal government and the provincial government, I'm not arguing that we should be subsidizing, by the way, the resource development, but we absolutely should not be producing obstacles. And I think Alberta, you just said it, Alberta sees obstacles. They say, we've got this huge resource, the world wants it. You, the rest of the country, or Ottawa, aren't letting us get these things. So we try to build a pipeline to the west and we get blocked by Alberta. We try to build a pipeline, Energy East, we get blocked by Quebec. We have, there's a lot of angst about Bill C-69, which is affectionately known as the No New Pipelines, bill. But they see that as a bill that is, it's not designed literally to prevent pipelines, but effectively it is a huge obstacle. The emissions cap is something that is a policy that is directed not at all heavy industry. It's directed at Alberta and oil and gas, which means disproportionately at Alberta. So I think all of these things are viewed as obstacles to Alberta's economic advancement. And I think they are legitimate sources of, anger, alienation, whatever word you want to use. And it puzzles me, and maybe we can get into the election campaign if you want to, but it puzzles me, as I say in the column, that Mark Carney hasn't seen this yet and responded to it yet. I mean, my recommendation to him, if you were to ask my advice, is scrap the emissions cap, right? If he stands up and says he wants to produce more, he wants to make Canada a energy superpower in both conventional and clean energy. He says he wants to build new pipelines. He says we care about pipelines now because of the threats from the United States. But he also says he's going to keep the emissions cap. Well, it's pretty actually hard to put that emissions cap in place, I think, and scale up production. So I think there's a something there that doesn't quite add up.
we'll get to some of these specific policies in a moment. Here's part of the problem. And again, keep in mind, viewers, that I've been working on this for 15 years, and I've been particularly involved in the energy conversation within Alberta and explaining the narratives that come out of there. And so I want to do that now. Within Alberta, the industry, the government, Premier Danielle Smith on down, the business community, lots and lots of Albertans believe explicitly in the OPEC narrative of the oil future. And if you look at the modeling from World Oil Outlook 2045 and 2050, OPEC says that oil demand is going to rise from 103 million barrels a day today to 120 million barrels a day in 2050. So Alberta looks at that and goes, well, why can't I have some of that? Danielle Smith says we want to double oil production, which means doubling oil sands production. Basically, it's the only resource that could expand that much, and which would be about a quarter of that demand. Why can't we have that? And then we would be up with Russia and Saudi Arabia. Here's the problem: there's a counter narrative to that based on other modeling. The International Energy Agency, for example, models that oil demand will peak in 2030, fall fairly quickly after that. What China is doing in terms of electrifying its economy and helping Asia and Latin America electrify their economies, particularly transportation, which is 45% of global oil demand. There is an argument, Chris, that in fact, Alberta's view of the world is very narrow. And they don't take into account risk factors like where are the markets? What happens if the markets start to shrink, just as we're building all of this infrastructure to get to those markets? And this conversation needs to be broader. It needs to be more nuanced, and it needs to acknowledge that the global energy system is changing profoundly and rapidly.
Fair enough. But let me say, you talked about two scenarios. The OPEC scenario, where world oil demand goes up to 120 or 125 million barrels a day and then starts to decline, or the IEA one, where it peaks in 2030, probably just a little bit above where it is now, and then starts to decline. I look at those and I go, well, okay, I don't know which one of those is true, and neither do either of those two agencies, right? We don't know exactly how the world will unfold. We don't know how technology will develop. We don't know, what kind of rates of growth there will be in different countries, right? These are forecasts, fine. Lots of uncertainty. I think in either of those scenarios or anything in between, okay, it's legitimate for Alberta to say, we would like at least a chance of selling more of our resources to that world. So, I mean, Alberta's only selling 4.5 million barrels a day. I think that's what the number is, exported 4.5 million barrels a day. Why couldn't they go to 6 or 6.5 or 7? Okay. And again, if you might say there may not be a market, and I'm saying I don't know if there is a market, but they can sort that out. The private sector producers can take those risks. They can make those estimates. They can build or not those facilities. They can build or not those pipelines. My position is our government also doesn't know how the world will unfold. Okay. And I would argue that our governments probably are less well placed to understand how the world will unfold than the executives and the whole team at Suncor or any other oil company who spends all their time thinking about the oil markets. And so, again, I think the government positions, federal and provincial, should be, we should not be an obstacle, right? If an oil company wants to develop a new facility and can do it in a locally environmentally sensible way, we should say, great, do it. And so I'm not actually advocating that Canada produce more oil. I'm advocating that Canada or Canadian producers be allowed to produce more oil if they decide they would like to. Just like I would advocate that, the Honda plant should be allowed to produce more cars if they think there's a market for it.
Here's the response to that. I think you're incorrect in arguing that the oil executives actually know the energy market. The oil executives are absolutely brilliant at knowing the oil market. Absolutely brilliant. And mainly for them, it's the American market. They don't, but I have had more than I've had plenty of conversations with people in the industry, associated with the industry, and their ignorance of the energy transition and the transition to electric technology, clean energy technologies is startling. Nobody spends their time in the studies that contradict OPEC. They are all in on OPEC. That's where their view of the world. And I argue that that view clouds their judgment because, hey, if you got a hammer, everything is a nail. And so for instance, they think that the global south is going to be using oil for 20, 30 years. The 75% of the cars in 2050 will be running on gasoline and diesel, on and on. The assumptions behind their math, behind OPEC's math, is pretty sketchy. It's already starting to unravel, but Canadian oil and gas industry is all in on that view of the future. And I argue that at the very least, if we're going to have a conversation about this, because you know as well as I do that there will be public money involved in building pipelines. The private sector will not fund 100% of those pipelines. They've already said as much. So if public money is involved, as a taxpayer, I want to know what the risk factors are. And at this point in the game, the energy transition and maybe even climate policy are major risk factors for building infrastructure that gets Alberta oil to global markets.
So, look, I guess I don't generally like the idea of public money being used for pipelines. I don't see a good reason for using public money in a pipeline. I mean, a pipeline is, and we can talk about TMX if you want. I think that was an accidental government purchase, frankly. But I mean, this is why I said I'm not looking for governments to subsidize production or to subsidize the building of a pipeline. I actually don't think that is necessary or appropriate. And then, if it is going to be built with private money, I think we can leave it to the private sector to take those risks. Now, you might say the private sector has its head in the sand, and it's not. It's not looking at the future the way it should be. Well, who am I? Who are you? Who is the government to tell the private sector how they should be making their forecasts? Unless you really believe that for some reason the government knows more about the world economy over the next 30 years than people that are studying it on a daily basis. And if you're going to say the government knows more than the oil companies about how the future is going to unfold, well, then I think you're a hop, skip, and a jump from an argument that says the government knows more about most industries than most firms, and therefore, why don't we have government involvement in every industry? And I think that would be a huge mistake. I think there's lots of things that the private sector does very, very well. And I think there's lots of things that the government sector does very, very poorly. And I see no reason, none, zero, to believe that any government knows how to take risks or evaluate risks about the profitability of oil production over the next 30 years more than an oil company. I'd love to hear that argument, but I've never heard that argument.
Well, let me give it to you. Okay, so Trans Mountain expansion, I hate to say it, Chris, but I fundamentally disagree with you here. I reported on that extensively from 2016 to 2019, and I read the National Energy Board decisions, and I read the National Energy Board Act. And this nonsense that somehow the Liberals, there was regulatory uncertainty, that is not what happened. What happened is under the NEB Act, the federal government delegates its exclusive jurisdiction over interprovincial infrastructure to the NEB to administer. And the NEB has the power of a superior court. So several times, thanks to the city of Burnaby, the city of Burnaby harassed and nipped at the heels of Kinder Morgan, the private company, for years. Dragged its feet on permits, on and on and on. And that and appealed to the NEB, and the NEB came back and said, "We are ruling as a superior court, or superior court. We uphold the notion of paramountcy. That means that the federal government's jurisdiction is recognized as being superior to that of the provincial government or a municipality. Over and over and over, the NEB ruled in favor of the project. What happened was the city of Burnaby was so determined and combined that with BC government, both of them took the project to court,
Okay.
and opposition from Indigenous groups and opposition from local people in Burnaby and the lower mainland. Kinder Morgan, faced with its own debt problems, just said, that's it. We've had enough. We're being hounded to the point where this thing is going to suck up our money for years, and we're not going to get anything out of it. No other private sector company would then touch it because of all the controversy attached to it. That's not a failure of liberal policy. That's
Fair
the
enough.
result of.
So you're okay. So you're laying the blame at the city of Burnaby and at the provincial government of BC. And if anything, your argument is that the feds were the good guys here, because they actually kept ruling in favor of the project, and then ultimately they came in their white horse and bought it and saved it.
Well, I would argue that the process worked as designed. And
Really?
absolutely. The federal government gives all of its authority on this, in this case, to the NEB, the regulator. And the regulator did exactly what it was supposed to do. The problem is the process and the authorities that the NEB have weren't designed to respond appropriately to the kind of pressure that was brought by the various levels of government and public opposition. And they just bogged it down. And you see, I went and I interviewed a number of American economists and legal scholars on this issue, and the Americans have the exact same problem with interstate pipelines. They have the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and environmental groups and indigenous groups, they sue every pipeline that goes across the border. It's very analogous to what went on in British Columbia. So I'm not saying that the liberal were great guys that were white knights. What they were is they followed the process as laid out in the legislation and the way it's been done for a long time. And
So
then,
it sounds to me then like there's still a pretty good case for reforming that process. So you talked about the city of Burnaby and the provincial government of BC, and if, environmental groups are going to just sue everybody around. So the process may allow for that, but I think then the belief would be there's still something wrong with that process. Not that everything is wrong with that process, but that process is, if the result is that a fundamentally attractive project gets abandoned by their private sector owner, and then the feds have to come in and either it's going to die or they have to buy it, then there's still something wrong with that process, it seems to me, no?
I think that's a fair argument. And I would also argue that C-69, the Impact Assessment Act,
Yeah.
didn't fix the process because that's a different part of the process. And so if you want to argue that, then I think that's a fair argument. But that now we're talking about reform of the regulator, reform of the legislation, the policy that informs how the regulator should undertake reviews and deal with other objections.
And so,
Hang on, I want to make an important point here. On March 19th, 14 oil and gas CEOs sent an open letter to the political leaders, and they said, we ask you to use all available emergency powers to put through LNG plants and pipelines, and that includes the Emergency Act, the old War Measures Act. And I think the fact that they would ask that federal legislation, federal authority to suppress dissent over a project like that is outrageous. And I think the oil sands CEOs, they should be embarrassed to have sent that letter. Because essentially what you're doing is asking the federal government to suppress democratic rights just so private sector operators can access markets.
Yeah, that does not strike me as the type of emergency that would invoke the Emergencies Act. No, but it seems to me then that there is still a need, and I want to bring this back to the election campaign, right? There's a need to reform. So Pierre Poilievre has committed to eliminating, I think his promise is, to eliminate Bill C-69. Mark Carney has committed to keeping it, but then he also talks about speeding up the approvals process. So I don't know whether Mark Carney is talking about reforming or modifying Bill C-69 or doing something else beside Bill C-69.
Right.
I'm not quite sure what he's suggesting, but it seems to me that he is looking at that outcome of TMX and still concluding TMX and other projects, and still concluding that the process is too slow. The process is too slow, and we've got to somehow change the process so that we can get projects approved much more quickly. And as a result of that, the investment and all of the economic benefits that come from the investment.
Let's shift a minute over to the emissions cap, because this is something, when I first met you, those many years ago, you were head of the Eco-Fiscal Commission. And we talked about carbon pricing. We talked about the industrial emitters carbon tax. So one of the things that I have done since then is I spent a lot of time in the emissions data. And one of the things that's very clear is Alberta and Saskatchewan produce 50% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. The oil and gas industry produces 28% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. And I would argue, because I've done the interviews with the oil companies, is that what they have done to reduce absolute emissions is meager at best. Because in those big corporations, and I've confirmed this with people who are involved in it, is budgets come at budgeting time, and the various departments bring their budgets to the CEO's table, and they argue for why they should get capital. And the CEO says to them, I will not give you a nickel to invest in something that doesn't have a positive return on it. If it has a negative return, I'm not interested in it. Greenhouse gas emissions, arguably, don't produce a positive return. Now, you being an economist, you could argue that avoiding the penalty per metric ton is the incentive. But then I would argue that because I just interviewed your old colleague Dave Sawyer, who said the industrial emitters carbon tax in Alberta is broken. Because what the government has done, while it agrees with the federal government, will tighten up tier and charge more, then on the other hand, it floods the market floods the credit market, thereby lowering the effective price of the carbon tax that the oil sands companies actually have to pay, and basically diluting the effect. So what we've seen is oil sands absolute emissions have risen. They've never peaked. They're still rising today. The oil and gas industry in Alberta peaked in 2019 and is today 1/2 of 1 megaton lower than it was in 2019. So essentially it's flat, within the margin of error here in measurement.
Yep.
So Carney looks at that, Trudeau looks at that and says, what do I have to do to get these guys to lower their emissions? They push back all the time. The Alberta government is with this idea of issuing too many credits and flooding the credit market, has found a workaround to basically make the industrial emitters carbon tax not workable. The only thing that's left to me is to slap on a cap and trade on top of that. I mean, I can see how that logic plays out.
No, I understand the logic. I think the logic is just wrong. So, when you observe that the emissions in one sector, even though it's a big sector, when the emissions in one sector aren't falling or are flatlining or falling very little, many people will look at that and say, something's not working. And I think that is the fundamental logical mistake. The way carbon pricing works, the whole logic of carbon pricing, is that you put a carbon price across the country, right? Across all provinces, across all sectors. And then you say, all right, now what this is designed to do is to reduce carbon emissions. And we know in aggregate, and we know that some sectors and some firms in sectors, some are going to reduce their emissions a lot, some will reduce emissions a little, some actually won't reduce emissions at all. Because for them, it is cheaper to pay the penalty, which is to pay the carbon price, than to actually go through the high cost of reducing their emissions. So, and this is, I think, a problem with, you mentioned Trudeau and Carney. Maybe even Carney suffers from this problem. I would hope that his microeconomics training was solid enough at Harvard and Oxford that he understands this problem, but you never know. But the fact that emissions don't fall everywhere at the same rate is not only not a bug, it is an absolute feature, a positive feature of carbon pricing. So I do not look for every sector to reduce emissions at the same rate. And keep in mind that the reason why emissions have been going up or flatlining at best in the oil and gas sector is because production has been going up.
Yeah.
So and in order for them to have emissions reductions, they would have to give up a bunch of those output increases, which of course would have a huge economic cost to it. So the whole point of carbon pricing isn't to reduce emissions, it's to reduce emissions in the lowest cost pattern possible. Okay. And that's why I think the emissions cap is a bad idea. The emissions cap, I understand the logic. I mean, I understand that a prime minister in Ottawa looks at the sector in Alberta and goes, those emissions aren't falling. What can we do to force those guys to reduce it? Well, hell, why don't you just close down the industry? Okay. But of course, that's exactly the fear, right? There's a lot of discussion about phasing out oil and gas in Ontario and Quebecers without, I think, any concept of what that means economically. But I think the emissions cap is a bad idea because what it's doing is that it's layering a second carbon price, right? Because that emissions cap is a cap and trade system, which would have a carbon price. You're layering a second carbon price on top of an existing, and I would argue, well-functioning, but I'll come back to that, industrial carbon price. Now, and so what you're going to have is a higher price, a higher carbon price for the oil and gas sector. So they might be facing at the margin, they might be facing, and I'm just making up numbers here, a $75 per ton carbon price, whereas the steel and, cement and other heavy industry sectors are facing a $50 carbon price. Well, some people will look at that and say it's unfair. Okay. I look at that and say it's also not very sensible in terms of trying to achieve emissions reductions at the lowest possible cost. Because the key point of how a carbon price works is that the way it minimizes costs is it does this very geeky equimarginal thing, right? So that all firms in all sectors end up facing the same carbon price and therefore the same incentives at the margin to reduce emissions. And that would be broken. Okay. So that's one reason why I think the emissions cap is a bad idea. The second idea is political, right? Is that it is just incredibly politically divisive. It wouldn't be so much, by the way, if every province produced oil and gas, right? But oil and gas is concentrated into 3 provinces and mostly into 1 province. So it is seen as picking on Alberta. Now, you might respond by saying, yes, but Alberta has the emissions. I say, fine, I get that. Alberta has lots of emissions. We have an industrial carbon price, ramp up the industrial carbon price, to which you will respond, but the feds don't have an industrial carbon price in Alberta because the province has their imperfect tier system, to which I would respond, well, if it really is an imperfect tier system, and I'm quite prepared to accept Dave Sawyer's view on this because he knows way more about the intricacies of these systems than I do, it might even no longer satisfy the Fed's requirements. So maybe the tier should get replaced with the Fed's OBPS system. But in either of those systems, there is going to be an issue about what's effectively free allowances, right? Free allowances aren't undermining the system. They are reducing the average cost per ton of carbon, but they're not necessarily reducing the marginal cost. So that's very geeky, but we can talk about that. So I still think the emissions cap is just a bad idea.
I argued against the emissions cap for pretty much the same reason that you just outlined here. Layering on 2 carbon taxes onto an industry is administratively and in regulatory, it's a problem. And I understand why the companies would push back against that. There's a lot of that. It's awkward at best. But here's another thing. 2016, 2017, 2018, I was out in the field interviewing people in the industry about carbon pricing because the NDP had just brought in their carbon cost incentive regulation, CCIR, which was based on OBPS. And I remember an interview in 2017 with Harbir China, who is the VP of technology at Cenovus Energy. And he said, look, we know where this is going. We understand that climate change is a real thing. We understand that we're a high emissions intensity crude oil. And we are the goal of the oil sands industry is to, in the future, become cost and carbon competitive. Because not only do we think that climate policies like the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism are coming, but we think the market is going to begin to price emissions in the not too distant future. So the problem here, he said, is that even though we understand it as an individual company, it's good for us to have a carbon price and get our carbon down. He said, you can't expect competitive companies to be the first. Nobody's going to come out of the chute and say to their investors, oh yeah, we volunteered to be the first one to pay extra costs. He said the government has to impose it. And so
Great.
back 8, 9 years ago, there was universal agreement in the oil sands industry that an industrial emitters carbon tax was a very good thing. It was in their same interest. In 2015, you'll remember that 4 oil sands CEOs stood behind NDP Premier Rachel Notley on the dais as she introduced the climate leadership plan because of that.
Yep.
Okay, fast forward now to today. That March 19th letter from the oil sands CEOs said, "Oh no, we're this is not fair. We want the industrial emitters carbon tax gone."
Yep.
Do you know what Suncor pays per barrel? Now, see, they don't calculate it as you do, like as applied to a marginal barrel. They average it out over all their barrels, and then they say to their investors, "We're only paying 47 cents."
Yeah.
And we forecast it out to 10 years, and we're only paying $1.70. Don't worry about it. This is not we can handle this thing.
So yeah. So look, I understand why they want the industrial carbon price gone. As I think I said in this column, or maybe it was a different one, but I think the oil companies are now looking at the political context and they're saying, look, we would prefer an industrial carbon price to more intrusive regulations, but maybe we prefer nothing to the industrial carbon price, and maybe nothing is currently a political option. I think they are sensing that maybe we can just abandon climate policy altogether. Now,
Yes,
I think that's a bad idea. Maybe that is what climate policy would look like under Pierre Poilievre. But Mark Carney has promised to not only retain the industrial carbon price, but to ramp it up. So look, I believe in climate change. I believe that we need a policy response. I completely understand that a private sector firm says, I don't want to be the first one to volunteer to incur costs. Of course, we need the government to force an internalization of this externality through policy, and I think a carbon price is the best way to do it. So I'm going to take the industrial carbon price as the right concept, okay? And now you can say, well, is it working well? And it's down to this kind of the design of it, because if Suncor is only paying 47 cents a barrel, but at the margin, they're paying, $80 per barrel, $80 per ton, of emissions, but that only translates on average to 47 cents a barrel. Then my guess is we have misdesigned the industrial carbon price, right?
Yes.
And I understand why we have effectively free allowances. We're trying to address the competitiveness issue. This is the thing that Pierre Poilievre doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand when he complains about the industrial carbon price. I mean, the whole point of OBPS is to provide an incentive to reduce emissions while protecting the business competitiveness.
Right.
Now, we might have got those design details wrong. We may have made it too generous in terms of the free allowances, and I suspect that we have. And I suspect that when they were designing the OBPS in the first place, there was lots of lobbying by the firms involved saying, oh, no, 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 we need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. And my guess is the government caved in that direction. So I'm all in favor of fixing that up. But again, come back to the emissions cap. If you give me a well-designed industrial carbon price that applies across the country and across sectors, then don't put an emissions cap on top of it for economic reasons and for political reasons. And, maybe, I mean, we're in a world of Trump-like threats, right? I mean, maybe the emissions cap is just a threat so that Alberta will fix its output-based carbon pricing. I've never heard that idea before. It just came out of my mouth. But, I don't know whether that's a good idea or not, right? But I would much rather have a well-designed industrial carbon price and no emissions cap than an emissions cap then layered on top of even a well-designed industrial carbon price.
I still maintain that the industrial carbon price that Notley brought in was very good. And even though the tier that Kenny brought in diluted it by a third, according to Andrew Leach in his blog, he did the numbers.
Yep.
Even still, that was okay. What we have today is not good. And the federal government has an equivalency agreement with Alberta on that carbon tax, and they have been at the table to renegotiate it I think it was a couple of years ago, and didn't address the stringency. So there's fault on both sides. But
right.
I want to move on from this, Chris, to the last point that we want to discuss, which is your argument that the export of Canadian liquefied natural gas (LNG) could lead to a reduction in global GHG emissions. Where is the evidence for that claim? I've never seen it. No one's shown their math.
Look, I've seen, and I don't have the site in front of me, but it's someplace in my email. I've seen a discussion of basically two possibilities. The possibility that you hear from Pierre Poilievre is that we will export our natural gas to India, our LNG to India, and it will displace their coal-fired electricity, and that will reduce emissions globally, which I think, if that actually happened, would be true. The other possibility is that you ship the LNG to India or China or wherever, and it doesn't displace coal-fired electricity. It ends up displacing renewables. Okay. In which case you've probably increased global emissions. So I'm not saying that this is true. I'm saying this. So, and I don't know whether it would reduce global emissions. And I think it's a possibility. It depends on those details, and you'd have to dig into those details very significantly. But it's a possibility that we shouldn't just toss out. Okay. But it's a possibility that also raises another problem. And this is, I think Pierre Poilievre, if you ask him what his climate policy is, he wouldn't say it's not much, although that's what all of the other parties would say. He would say, well, let's export our LNG to India and let's displace their higher carbon electricity. And there you go. We're reducing global emissions. So I think he's banking on this too much. My position, again, is if the world wants our LNG, either for environmental reasons or for energy security reasons, right? Because there's a new issue since January of 2022 that we're talking about. But if the world wants our LNG, we shouldn't be standing in the way of producing it, right? That's my basic position.
Okay.
Same thing as oil and natural gas and anything else, right? As long as we can produce it, in an environmentally responsible way. And I don't know whether that will reduce emissions or not globally. Okay.
Well, look, I've done some work on this. I mean, half of my interviews since 2019 have been with global experts. And I'm because I hear this all the time. This is a common talking point in Alberta. And the whole complaint about China burning coal and yada yada, so we shouldn't, give credence to anything they say. But here's the problem. When you begin to look at the Asian electricity systems, what you find, and China is leading on this and others are now moving kind of in its wake in that direction. what you find is they don't want to import oil and gas anymore. They see that as economic energy insecurity
Yep.
because they have to import. So what they're doing, and you look at China, they are deploying enormous amounts of wind, solar, nuclear, and hydro. And what the plan is, the strategy is, and I've talked to people from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, several of them, about the strategy here. The strategy is to build that out and to the point where it is as close to 100% as they will ever get. Then they're going to replace, and they're already replacing, their coal fleet with high efficiency coal plants, and they will keep them as backup. And they've already introduced a capacity market, right, to pay for plants that are idle. So they're there when they're needed. So if the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining and they haven't got enough power in the grid, they fire up the coal plants with these high efficient, and then they'll just burn that until the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. So that's where India is going to go. That's where the seven taggers are going to go. That's where the other countries here are headed towards. And there is not a big role for LNG. And let's not forget, there is an enormous supply coming on from the United States, Qatar, and other producers in 26 and 27. And if you look at where the IEA modeling, for example, there's a huge oversupply for about 10, 15 years after 27,
So
2027,
look, what you've just given is an argument that may be correct. I don't know. It may be correct that there is no market for Canadian LNG in the rest of the world. If there is no market for Canadian LNG in the rest of the world, fine. Then nobody will want to. No private sector player will want to spend a bunch of money to develop it because if you're so smart and you know there's no market for this product, then they will probably hire you. You will advise them. You will convince them. They will decide not to risk their money. Good. I'm completely fine with that outcome. I'm not saying that we should be exporting LNG. I'm saying that our government shouldn't be making that decision because I don't think our government, when Justin Trudeau said to the German chancellor, there is no business case for LNG, I honestly don't think Justin Trudeau or any government really has the expertise to make that assessment. I do think the private sector players who are putting their money at risk, and of course they will sometimes make mistakes, but they're the ones that should be making that assessment. So once again, I'm just saying I don't want to see government money in an LNG facility. I want to see the government not providing obstacles. So if you can't, if you decide not to build LNG, it's because you discern that there's no market out there. But so that nobody then could say, well, I want to build LNG, but Ottawa is standing in the way. That to me is the outcome we should be avoiding.
I have interviewed economists like Kevin Byrne at S&P Global, who's an expert in emissions and the oil sands, just as an example. And they have universally argued that the federal government's regulatory uncertainty has now raised the risk profile of building infrastructure around LNG, so gas basically, and oil pipelines, has raised it to the point where there is not a piece of infrastructure that will be built in Canada without government money in it. The projects need to be de-risked with public money. So right away, that's an objection.
The government's regulatory process needs to be, what you just said is that the regulatory process has raised the risk to the point
Yes,
where it
that's
needs government money. Well, you could also reform the regulatory process to de-risk it.
Yes, you could, but there's a perception of risk, and I just interviewed Professor Sean Fluker from the University of Calgary Law Department, who said the Impact Assessment Act has been grossly misinterpreted, is not nearly as restrictive, and is very similar to what Stephen Harper brought in 2012 under C. I forget what that stands for. So, but I want to raise another issue. I've done a lot of work on environmental liabilities attached to the Alberta oil and gas industry, which has almost 80,000 inactive wells,
Orphan wells,
and has already the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is very industry friendly, says that the environmental liabilities for the oil sands are $50 billion. They're probably much. Other studies from the AER say much higher, but let's say $50 billion. They have a mine financial security program that has $1 billion in it. And there's a fundamental problem here because every province, but particularly Alberta, decided not to take security on reclamation at the beginning of the project. They said oil companies are going to be around forever. We'll take it at the end of the asset's life. And
when they're bankrupt.
that is a fundamental mistake. Nothing's changed. And so what we're doing, if we expand the oil sands and we expand gas production and pipelines and all of that stuff, we're setting ourselves up to do nothing but increase the severity of the problem we have with liabilities should those projects not pan out and we're stuck.
Well, I think I'm not an expert at all on the orphan wells issue, but it does seem to me that what you just pointed out was the mistake, is they didn't take security up front, and they should have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so maybe if we build a new pipeline, maybe we do that. Maybe we learn from that mistake and say, okay, there's going to be some environmental liabilities associated with this new infrastructure that we're thinking about building. And if we do proceed to build it, let's take some money, some security up front. I mean, we can fix these problems if we choose to. We could fix the orphan wells problem if we choose to. We could fix a regulatory process that is creating too much risk if we choose to. I don't think we should just say we'll take the institutions as they are, and under those conditions, we now need public money. I think if you need public money, and by the way, I'm not an enemy of public investment, but it just seems to me that a pipeline or an LNG facility is not the obvious kind of thing where you should need public money. We should have a regulatory process that is complete, but also streamlined, so that the private sector can make those assessments. If there's a market, they'll take the plunge. If there's no perceived market, they won't take the plunge. If we need to set aside money up front to address environmental liabilities down the road, we can do that if we have the political will to do it. These are eminently solvable problems.
And the problem, Chris, is we're not having that conversation. If we were having that,
we're not having many conversations.
Hang on a second. On this show, we don't talk over each other. The problem here, if we were having a national energy conversation where we said, look, we're going to rely on the private sector to determine the amount of risk, determine the amount of market opportunity. If they think it's good, then fine, we're okay with it, and we will reform the processes, whether it's the Industrial Emitters Carbon Tax, whether it's the Impact Assessment Act, whatever it is, we will reform it to conform to those kind of standards that we require as a country. If they were having that conversation, and the oil and gas industry was having that kind of conversation, I'd be much more supportive. It's not the conversation we're having. That's the problem.
I agree with that. And look, I think we're not having that right conversation. We're not having a lot of right conversations, in my view. I mean, we could talk about healthcare or housing or, other issue, immigration, right? There's lots of issues that we're not talking about very sensibly. But look, I think there has been a fundamental problem in the whole energy and climate discussion that we have had or not had in a very sensible way for I don't know, a bunch of years, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, sure.
In my end of the country, people think that aggressive climate policy is essential. And there's a lot of people who really think we need to phase out oil and gas. Mm-hmm. At the other end of the country, in Alberta, there's people that view climate policy as an existential threat to oil and gas.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
And I think both of those views are wrong. Okay,
and I would agree. Well,
I think we can. I think we can have very well designed climate policy, which is fundamentally designed at using less fossil fuels, producing fewer emissions from the use of fossil fuels. So, it applies to trucking and trains and home furnaces and cars and all kinds of things like that, and in our production methods. And at the same time, we can say we're still going to produce and sell oil and natural gas to the world that needs it. And for as long as the world wants to buy Canadian and Albertan oil and natural gas. And those two things need not be threats to one another, okay? I mean, Canadian climate policy is not really much of a threat to the Alberta oil industry that exports 85% of its production, right? So, So that's the conversation that we do not have in this country. At my end of the country, they need to recognize the enormous economic value that comes from producing oil and gas. And at the Alberta end of the country, they need to understand that climate policy shouldn't be and isn't really a threat to their industry, which is again why I would argue that the emissions cap is a bad idea, but why well-designed industrial carbon pricing is a good idea.
And let's end the interview this way. I've done a lot of work since 2017 when the Alberta Innovates introduced its bitumen beyond combustion program. And they are now, they say, about a year away from having a commercial process to turn bitumen into carbon fiber, commercial carbon fiber. And they can turn it into asphalt binder and activated carbon and others. Because the bitumen molecule, the hydrocarbon molecule, is different than any other hydrocarbon molecule. It's ideally suited to use as feedstock for advanced materials manufacturing. And I've interviewed people like Dr. Ibrahim Alba, the Saudi Aramco's VP of technology. He says the future of oil and gas is in materials, not as feedstock for fuels. Okay. So here we have in Alberta, we have a market that over the long arc of time is going towards materials. We have a resource of enormous abundance that actually has 4 times the value if you turn it into a material than it does if you turn it into a fuel. And we have Alberta government owns the intellectual property for the process to turn bitumen into carbon fiber. This is, if we were going to think of a future for the oil sands, and let's assume that I'm right, just for sake of argument, and that we're going to see oil demand drop. I would argue that the oil sands could have a future beyond into the 22nd century as a source of feedstock for materials. And it would create more wealth and more jobs and more business opportunities than simply selling it to American refineries. And the problem is we can't have that conversation.
Why can't we?
Well, because the players who dominate the conversation, like the Alberta government and the CEOs, they like the status quo. They love the status quo. They're incumbents and they don't want things to.
But hold on. If there is, I think you said 4 times as much economic value in using your bitumen for materials rather than fuels. If that's really true, and frankly, it doesn't have to be 4 times, twice would be fine, right? But if there's a lot more value in that, if you're right on that, then I'm pretty sure you're not the only person that knows that, right? So if it's right, then at some point, the executives of those oil companies say, you know what, we can actually make more money doing something else. So let's do that something else. I mean, I really do. I don't think the private sector is perfect by any means, but I think the private sector is pretty good. And they're pretty good, again, not perfect, at detecting profit opportunities. And if you know this, then 5 other people know it. And, one of them might work at an oil company and it won't take very long before they start doing this. So why aren't they doing it?
Why aren't they doing it? Because first of all, we're in the early stages. We still don't have a proven commercial process. So, fair enough. We're the Americans love this because if this was in the United States, DARPA or some military industrial complex, somebody somewhere would be de-risking that process and getting ready to scale it up to commercial scale when the process was ready. But we're not there. We're in Canada, so we do things differently. And the numbers, by the way, come from Alberta Innovates modeling that was revised in like early 2024 or something. So it's fairly recent. I didn't just dream those up. The problem here is your take on this, and I get this. I mean, you laid out how you think about the private sector and markets very clearly. Got it. I hew towards Peter Lougheed's take on this, which is that government has to intervene sometimes because the private sector is just too comfortable with the way things are. And while there are profits maybe to be made over here, we're not that interested in it. And the government intervenes because it owns the resource under the Canadian Constitution. It says, I'm a stakeholder here, and I want to create more value for the people of Alberta. And so we're going to make sure that ethane has to be stripped out of natural gas. And lo and behold, we have the second biggest petrochemical complex in North America because of those policies and a whole bunch of other stuff.
So you just raised a great point, right? The fact that the Alberta government is the owner of the oil sands, right? The people of Alberta own those oil sands. And that, to me, gives, and you just said it, right? It gives the government or the people, right? A clear stake in that resource development that is not there for producing cars or growing canola or something else, right? Because the oil sands are this resource that's owned by the people underneath the ground,
Right.
and so I am, to me, this gives a powerful argument for the government to be involved. Again, I'm not saying that government should never be involved, and this is exactly a place where government should be involved. But I also think we have to be careful how to make the government involved, and I also like the idea of de-risking. So, there's a lot of discussion these days about industrial policy and the need for a very aggressive industrial policy, and this makes me fairly queasy. Okay, but the part of it that I am pretty comfortable with is to identify the riskiness of different kinds of projects and to recognize that our capital markets actually aren't probably as good as we would like them to be.
Right.
Okay?
Fair enough. Fair comment.
So whether it's the commercial banks or venture capital or something else, like the very sort of simple pro-market view is we've got a capital market that can address that can take those risks, no need for intervention.
Right.
Well, we actually have some market failures in some situations, and we have capital markets that I think aren't processing some of those risks. And so I think we do have a need, and over the years we have established financial crown corporations, whether it's Farm Credit Corporation or BDC or EDC or now the Infrastructure Bank. So I actually think there is a way to think about this, to think about government involvement. To me, it doesn't mean government should build a pipeline, okay? But it means that government can play a very useful role in de-risking. And with this underlying idea that you mentioned, that let's keep in mind that the Alberta government owns this resource. So it has a clear incentive in getting this stuff developed so that the people of Alberta can benefit from it. And so I accept all of that. I think we got to be careful how we do it, but I accept the basic principle.
In 45 minutes, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Bentley Allen, who is an expert in industrial policy, and his
to the extent that such a thing exists.
To the extent that such a
he
thing
certainly thinks he's an expert on industrial policy. He's got a plan, that's for sure.
Fair enough. But Bentley's point is that in the past it was governments picking winners and choosers, trying to build up champions like Nortel and SNC-Lavalin or Bombardier or whatever the case was. But modern industrial policy is different. Government, yes, can lead with other levels of government and with the private sector and with labor and with other stakeholders. And you see the hydrogen hub that's developing in Edmonton as proof of that policy, that strategic approach. And so I think he would agree with you that government doesn't have to own everything, government doesn't have to do everything, but government can act as a catalyst, and it can play a role in that process where it's appropriate today for it to play in that. And I've been arguing in Alberta for 5 years now that approach to developing a materials manufacturing industry based on Alberta hydrocarbons is the right way to go. But the government still has to play a leadership role. On this, the governments we have today, the Conservative Party and even the Liberal Party in Ottawa, weren't geared that way and just weren't able to or willing to undertake that.
Let me say, there's a difference between saying the government can play a catalytic role and the government should play a catalytic role, okay? I think we would all agree that the government can or could play a catalytic role in various ways. Where Bentley and I suspect, disagree is the situations where he thinks the government absolutely should be involved. And some of those will be situations where I say, sorry, I just do not see the compelling case for the government to be involved. And the mere fact that the government gets involved in something to help the hydrogen industry, and then you have a hydrogen industry, to me, that is not the measure of success, okay? Presumably we're doing this to increase prosperity, more generally. And, I think this is a real problem, a real challenge with the people that advocate aggressive industrial policy is that I think they tend to be pretty weak on the measures of success. Um,
Okay, fair
and
enough.
yeah, and that's so anyway. So I am not arguing that government should be involved. Absolutely, government can be involved in some situations. They can be, but I think we have to think more carefully about whether they should be involved and even how to be involved. And to me, my guiding principle still comes down to market failures, right? Is that I want to know how the government can improve the market outcome here, or the flip side of the question is, what is it that the private sector is now unable to do and why? Let me understand the nature of the market failure is, and then we can design, because you got to know that if the government is going to improve the market outcome, then we better understand the sense in which the private sector is failing, because that will then influence the way you design the government intervention in some way. Anyway, that's
Chris, this has been a fascinating conversation. I thank you very much for it. We better wrap it up, or we're going to be doing this all day. So
indeed.
we'll have you back in the future, in the not too distant future. We won't wait 5 years this time, and we'll continue this conversation. I'm sure we'll be talking about other things, but we'll continue the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Markham. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.